Anti-war movements are campaigns that protest a country's involvement in a war. Prior to the 20th century, anti-war movements were less prevalent and widespread across the world because citizens had minimal influence on their government's decisions. This is because before the Enlightenment, a state's power was largely reserved for a small group of government officials. One example of an earlier anti-war movement was seen in Britain's American colonies. Before World War I, loyalists in the American colonies resisted the American Revolution because they were content with their current social and economic statuses. Their failure to prevent the revolution is significant because it portrays how before the 1900s, anti-war movements existed, but they were small-scale and largely motivated by personal desires.
Halt, citizen. You are not authorized to enter the premises. Please leave immediately, or I will have to use force. Well, that was rather easy. Anyway, back to...
Rosa Luxemburg resisted World War I by creating the Spartacus League in Germany and uniting people against war. Rosa Luxemburg was a part of the Social Democratic Party, SDP, in Germany at the start of World War I. However, when the SDP decided to back the German government and support the war, Luxemburg partnered with other like-minded radicals such as Karl Liebknecht to create the Spartacus League. The Spartacus League was simply a revolutionary socialist group who deeply opposed Germany's involvement in World War I. This group attempted to end the war by leading protests in German streets and establishing a proletarian government, which is basically an intermediate between communism and capitalism. The German government attempted to vilify Luxemburg as Bloody Rosa in the press due to her increasing impact on the public. With this, Rosa's anti-war protests are important because they portray how German anti-war movements were often invoked by socialists and were fairly unsuccessful due to suppression by the powerful government.
The Seattle Central Labor Union resisted World War I in the USA by leading protests and attempting to convince government officials to support their position. As rumors of America's involvement in World War I began to heighten, many major U.S. cities formed anti-war groups for reasons such as religion, fear of conscription, etc. One of these groups was the Seattle Central Labor Union, and they specifically resisted President Roosevelt's preparedness movement that aimed to prepare the U.S. military to enter World War I. The Seattle Central Labor Union contacted several congressmen and even President Wilson as an attempt to convince them of the consequences that entering the war would cause. Not only this, but they protested in the streets of Seattle and union halls. However, after President Wilson's declaration of war, U.S. citizens adopted a large sense of patriotism and intensely opposed any opposition to the U.S. war effort. After being called traitors by the Seattle Times and the Seattle Central Labor Union, dissipated and ended up having an insignificant impact. This is significant because it portrays how anti-war movements in the U.S. were overpowered by strong patriotic ideals and were not supported by a minority of the public.
Citizens of British colonial India protested their mother country due to Britain's unfulfilled promises following World War I. In return for aiding Britain in World War I, India was promised self-governance, among other freedoms. When these promises were not upheld, the Indian National Congress, or the INC, formed and became an influential voice for the Indian independence. The INC inspired a protest in Amritsar, Punjab, that was demanding justice after 2 Indian freedom fighters were arrested. However, these resistance efforts ended in disaster when protesters were massacred by colonial forces, killing 379 people and wounding several hundred more. As the failed protest turned into the massacre at Amritsar, it conveyed that Britain's superior military was easily able to squash this colonial uprising. This is significant because it conveys that colonial revolts during this time were largely unsuccessful, especially concerning a powerful country like Britain.
The Peace Pledge Union contributed to World War II resistance in Britain by encouraging conscription refusal and organizing protests. The PPU was founded by Richard Shepherd, who was a veteran and committed pacifist. Initially, the PPU was restricted to men only, as the founders aimed to debunk the former misconception that peace movements were only supported by women. In just a few months, the Peace Pledge Union gained over 100,000 members. They resisted World War II by encouraging men to refuse to join the military and compensating ones who did so. They also had a fairly successful newsletter in which they shared their anti-war ideas. As many members of the PPU were veterans, their opinions about Hitler became their demise. One member, named Alfred Sauter, voiced his opinion that while he disapproved of the Nazis' brutality, he still didn't believe that interfering with the Nazis was worth the massive bloodshed of the hundreds of thousands of British soldiers that would ensue. As the majority of the British population saw this opinion as immoral and outlandish, the PPU never gained much traction or influence. This is significant because it portrays how the indisputably horrible actions of Nazi Germany made it very difficult for anti-war movements during World War II to be successful.
Japanese members of the Fair Play Committee in the United States resisted World War II by protesting the required conscription in the war. Following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, President Roosevelt authorized the removal of 110,000 innocent Japanese immigrants of ethnic Japanese citizens to internment camps in the U.S. These camps were isolated places of incarceration that existed for 3 years. Following this clear violation of civil rights, President Roosevelt announced that these interned Japanese people would be drafted for the U.S. war effort. This order rightfully upset many Japanese Americans, so they formed the Fair Play Committee at the Hart Mountain Camp in Wyoming. The Fair Play Committee protested the announcement of their conscription as well as their incarceration. They organized a draft refusal movement in which for every 9 men drafted, 8 refused to show up for induction. This is significant because it portrays how anti-war groups in the U.S. began to gain success little by little. It also portrays how even people who were considered traitors and a threat to the U.S. were being drafted for their American war effort. This establishes the enormous number of Americans being drafted and the U.S.'s desperation for soldiers during World War II.
German officials within the ranks of the Nazi regime attempted to resist World War II by planning the Oster Conspiracy of 1938. As rumors of Czechoslovakia's annexation and the possibility of war arose, Germany was on the brink of war. After a territory dispute with Britain's Prime Minister, Hans Oster, a lieutenant second in command at the German military intelligence, wanted to prevent a large-scale war that could ensue. With this, he teamed up with other important German figures and planned the Oster Conspiracy, which was essentially a plan to kill Adolf Hitler. This plan was for a small group of soldiers to meet at the army headquarters and be given guns and ammunition. They would then attack the Chancellery, arrest Hitler, and make sure he was killed. However, this plan was abandoned last minute because Hitler backed down and his land demands and agreed to have a conference instead. As this event could have ended World War II before it even started, it is a good representation of how some people who seemingly stood with evil were actually conscious of the damage that the war would cause. It also conveys how anti-war movements could be formed as internal rebellions, and they could be formed by anyone, even those with power. The Cuban Missile Crisis marked a time when two major world powers were closer to nuclear war than ever before. And with this came a large-scale anti-war resistance. In the early years of the Cold War, Cuba had a revolution and appointed the Castro regime as their new government. When the US attempted to overthrow the Cuban government, Soviet leaders secretly reached an agreement with Cuba, which allowed for Soviet missiles to be kept on Cuban soil. The Cuban Missile Crisis refers to when President John F. Kennedy announced the discovery of Soviet missiles on Cuba. As Cuba is just 90 miles south of Florida, panic ensued. The US and the Soviet Union were on the brink of a nuclear war. 2 days following this announcement, a peace march was held in the Union Square of San Francisco. Thousands of people showed up to fight for nuclear disarmament, despite media hostility and police harassment. This is significant because it reaffirms the idea that society's fear of nuclear war united them as they fought for disarmament and peace. The unity, therefore, increased their success on their anti-war movements.
As a result of increased nuclear power used in the Cold War, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, C&D, formed to resist nuclear warfare. As the US, the Soviet Union, and Britain had established their presence of their atomic weapons, fear of nuclear warfare spread throughout the world. With this, the C&D launched in London in 1958. The C&D had members from all walks of life, such as scientists, environmentalists, religious leaders, and more. The C&D advocated for unilateral disarmament, which called upon Britain to eradicate their nuclear weapons with hope that other powerful states would follow. The C&D hosted countless protests calling on their government to make friends, not bombs. Their most famous one, though, was in October 1983, when 300,000 people gathered in Hyde Park to protest nuclear warfare. While the C&D didn't have a significant impact, their anti-war efforts convey how the damage and fear that characterize most countries as a result of atomic warfare created a common cause for them to unite against.
In the United States, college campuses became a focal point for anti-war protests regarding the Cold War. As news coverage of the war featured graphic visuals of death and destruction, many U.S. citizens became unsupportive of the war. As universities were already places of political activism and the UC Berkeley free speech movement had just ensued, many people gathered at universities for anti-war protests. Anti-war movements intensified when President Lyndon B. Johnson escalated U.S. troop presence in Vietnam. After hosting many protests and uniting all anti-war groups under one common cause, the student movement actually had a considerable influence. As an attempt to end the protests and unrest, President Nixon reduced the U.S. troop presence in Vietnam and also reformed the draft. This is significant because it shows how when the U.S. public was united under a common cause, their anti-war movements could actually be achieved.
Throughout World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, there is a common trend for the success of anti-war movements to be dependent on public support. One way this is seen is through the Peace Pledge Union's efforts to resist World War II. Despite their protests, speeches, and marches, British citizens largely opposed Hitler's brutality and thus supported Britain's involvement in the war. This conveys how, since the Peace Pledge Union was not supported by the public, their war resistance movement never attained much success. Another example of this is the U.S. student movement resistance to the Cold War. In this case, the student movement actually did have support from the majority of the public, as citizens were generally scared of conscription and horrified by the news coverage of the war. Due to their immense support, the student movement was able to achieve some of their goals and reduce U.S. troop presence in Vietnam. This is significant because it portrays how support from the public was a necessary ingredient in anti-war movement's recipe for success. Not only that, but this continuity provides a viable reason for the failure of many anti-war movements over the years, as hardly any of them were ever widely supported by their countries.
One way that anti-war movements evolved over time is in terms of their size, as they transferred from small-scale organizations to large and powerful movements. Rosa Luxemburg's Spartacus League is a prime example of this. This World War I resistance group consisted of like-minded German radicals who broke apart from the Social Democratic Party. As their group's members were mainly one demographic, German socialists, the group never gained an overwhelming amount of support or members. With this, their protests were generally underwhelming and at small scale. However, as time went on, anti-war movements grew in size and impact. An example of one of these more modern movements is the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, that formed to resist the Cold War. The CND was a huge organization that hosted enormous protests. In fact, they once hosted a march of over 300,000 people in October 1983. The sheer size is due to the fact that their members came from all walks of life and were united under a common cause. This is significant because it portrays how when anti-war organizations became inclusive instead of exclusive, their events became much larger and had a wider impact.
Now for our latest story, at exactly 12 p.m. Central Time, a man was seen breaking into the Ace Intelligence facility wearing a
Responsibility personal, responsibility personal, responsibility personal, responsibility.